Imagine lying in a damp, creaky wooden bed, wrapped in coarse wool blankets that haven't been washed since the last plague scare. Your roommate is a toothless blacksmith who snores like a dying cow, and the chamber pot under your bed is, let's just say, full. Welcome to your luxurious stay at a 1700s boarding house, where sleep was optional and disease was complimentary. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a one-way ticket to the most miserable shut-eye imaginable. So fluff your pillows, dim the candlelight, and let's tuck into the filthiest bedtime story you've ever heard. If you're still awake by the end of this, you deserve a medal, or at least a like, a comment, and a sub. Go ahead. It's more hygienic than sharing a bed with strangers. If you've ever complained about hotel pillows being a little too firm, buckle up, because we're about to drag you into a time when sleeping was an act of bravery, and the phrase, bed and breakfast, often meant plague and porridge. Welcome to the 1700s, an era where sanitation was optional, privacy was a myth, and the best-case scenario was waking up without lice in your eyebrows. Now, let's set the stage. It's the mid-1700s. Maybe you're in the middle of London, a city that smells like ambition, desperation, and horse droppings. Or maybe you're in Boston, where the streets are mud, the politics are tense, and the local cure for insomnia is rum laced with laudanum. Wherever you are, one thing is clear. You need a place to sleep, a roof, a bed, and if possible, something less than six-legged sharing it with you. Enter the boarding house. Imagine the worst Airbnb you've ever booked. Now, remove central heating, strip out personal bathrooms, add several strangers, two of them drunk, one of them possibly dying, and one who keeps muttering in Latin. Multiply the smell by 14, and congratulations, you're now picturing a typical 18th century boarding house. Our story tonight follows a man named Thomas. He's fictional, sure, but based on enough historical records that you can smell the ink on his calloused fingers. Thomas is a journeyman printer, middle class by technicality, broke by reality. He travels from town to town, job to job, sleeping where he can afford it, or where he can bribe the landlady with extra firewood. And tonight, after a long day dodging horse carts and setting type, he stumbles through the warped wooden door of Miss Greeley's Lodgings for Gentlemen, where the only gentle thing is the way the roof leaks onto the staircase. Inside, the air is thick, not just humid, but chewy. There's a stew boiling on the hearth, or maybe it's just socks. A shriveled man with a pipe glances up from the corner and releases a cough that could clear a room if anyone had the strength to move. The floorboards sag like they've given up. The wallpaper peels like it's trying to escape, and the fire in the hearth is doing its best impression of warmth. Thomas negotiates for a bed. And by negotiates we mean he hands over a few coins, promises not to start any fights, and agrees to sleep above the butcher this time. Room 7.5. It's not on the floor plan because the floor plan was lost in a fire 3 tenants ago. As he climbs the stairs, which may be stairs, or just really persistent planks, he passes other doors. Behind one, a baby is crying. Behind another, someone's praying. From another, someone's definitely doing something less holy. It's a soundtrack of human exhaustion, punctuated by groans, creaks, and the rhythmic thud of someone trying to kill a rat with a boot. Now, let's talk expectations. Thomas knows this won't be luxury. He knows the mattress will be stuffed with straw. The pillow will smell like hair oil and regret, and the walls will be thin enough to hear the baker next door grinding his teeth in his sleep. But still, he hopes naively for quiet. Spoiler, he does not get it. The bed creaks like a ship in a storm. The candle on the nightstand flickers, as if it too wants to leave. There's a window, sort of, a pane of fogged glass that leaks more cold than light. A single blanket lies folded at the foot of the bed, covered in something that might be soot, or ink, or plague. Who can say? Let's pause here for a moment. Just breathe this in. The candle wax, the smoke, the stew sock combo. Let it seep into your imagination. Because this was life for thousands of people, every night, not just for one Thomas, but for merchants, travelers, immigrants, widows, spinsters, and anyone else who couldn't afford solitude. Boarding houses weren't just places to sleep. They were where you lived your life, and where you hoped not to end it. In cities they lined the streets like crooked teeth, each one promising a meal and a bed, and delivering just enough discomfort to keep you moving. Some were run by industrious widows who took in lodgers to survive. others by shady entrepreneurs who saw no moral issue in charging extra for firewood and not removing corpses until Thursday. And privacy? Oh, sweet summer child. The concept of a private room was for the rich or the criminal. Most boarders shared space, sometimes a bed, always a chamber pot. If you were lucky, the person next to you was only snoring. If you were unlucky, they were contagious. Thomas unpacks his small satchel. One shirt, one crust of bread, a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe. He wedges his boots under the bed, careful not to touch anything else under there, and sits. The bed groans. The ceiling sags. The sounds of other lives continue around him. Whispers, coughs, murmurs, footsteps, the occasional distant scream, normal stuff. And he wonders, will he sleep tonight? Or will he lie awake, counting rats like sheep, listening to the moans of people dreaming of better days? That's the thing about history. We think of it as dates and battles. But really, it's the creak of a floorboard. The sigh of someone folding into their fifth borrowed bed that month. The silent negotiation between exhaustion and fear. Thomas lies down. The blanket is scratchy. The pillow is damp. Someone in the room next door coughs 3 times, pauses, and coughs again. He stares at the ceiling and listens to the boarding house breathe. Can he make it through the night without catching something medieval? Well, that depends. How close is he to the chamber pot? There's a unique sound that only a 1700s boarding house can make. It's somewhere between a floorboard sighing and a roof tile giving up. Not quite a creak, not quite a groan, more like the house itself muttering same under its breath. And that sound, that's structural integrity, or rather, the lack thereof. Let's talk about the building, because before you can understand the misery of sleeping inside one, you've got to understand what was holding these sad little rectangles of suffering together, and the answer is nothing good. Most boarding houses were built quickly, cheaply, and with all the architectural foresight of a drunk raccoon stacking Jenga blocks. These weren't majestic colonial manors or fancy Georgian estates. No, these were the hastily assembled afterthoughts of urban sprawl, propped up between butcher shops and coal alleys, built from wood too soft and nails too few. Imagine a popsicle stick shack with delusions of grandeur. Now fill it with people and rats. The exteriors leaned. Not metaphorically, physically. Entire blocks of homes tilted like they were conspiring to whisper gossip across the alley. Some structures bowed inward from age, others outward from poor foundations, and a few just sagged in the middle like an overworked mattress. If gravity had feelings, it would have sued. Thomas's current abode, Mrs. Greeley's, had what you might generously call a charming asymmetry. The kind of place that looked like it was drawn by a child who was asked to describe a house but wasn't allowed to use a ruler. The upper floors jutted out slightly, a design feature from medieval times, meant to protect pedestrians from falling waste, which was sweet, if you ignored the fact that the gutter system was just hope and aim. Inside, the architecture didn't improve. The stairs were warped and uneven, like a drunken escalator. Some steps were wider than others, and one in the middle squeaked like a tortured violin every time Thomas passed, which was comforting, in a my house is crying kind of way. The walls were paper thin, and not just in the emotional sense. Actual paper sometimes lined the gaps between wood slats to keep out the wind, and by paper, we mean literal newspaper. So if you ever wanted to read 3-year-old headlines while freezing your feet off, congratulations, you were living the dream. Plaster was more suggestion than standard. Cracks ran like road maps through ceilings, walls, even across the hearth. In one corner of Thomas's room, a small fungus colony had formed. He named it Jeremy. It didn't pay rent, but at least it didn't snore. And then there was the floor. Oh, the floor. Have you ever stepped on something that felt both hollow and suspiciously damp? Every plank beneath Thomas's boots had its own personality. Some squeaked, some thudded. One just wobbled slightly, as though contemplating retirement. At night, the boards expanded and contracted with the temperature, breathing in tandem with the cold outside, groaning, settling, and occasionally snapping just enough to jolt a half-asleep man into full paranoia. If Thomas dared walk barefoot, which he didn't, not after last week's splinter incident, he could feel the uneven grain under his soles, the gaps between planks big enough to lose a coin in, or possibly a small pet, somewhere between the wood and whatever lay beneath it. A forgotten basement? The abyss? Things skittered. Things with tails. Probably dreams. Definitely diseases. Let that sink in. These weren't homes built to last. They were structures meant to survive just long enough to collect rent. Comfort was irrelevant. Safety was aspirational. And sleeping inside one of these wooden tombs meant placing your trust in beams held together by mold, nails forged in haste, and optimism soaked in ale. Windows were another adventure. Thin, wavy glass. If you were lucky enough to have it. Let in just enough light to remind you how little you slept. Drafts slid through every gap, like whispers of ghosts long gone. Shutters clattered in the wind like loose teeth. And curtains? If you had cloth over the window, it was probably your extra shirt. The roof, of course, was its own saga. Shingles? Loose. Gaps? Plentiful. Water damage? Biblical. When it rained, it wasn't a question of whether the leak would drip on your head. It was about how many buckets you could position strategically before falling asleep. And if you were on the top floor like Thomas, you got first dibs on sky water. Luxury. Let's pause here for a breath. Not too deep, though. The air might taste like dust, ash, and slow decay. Still, inhale the ambiance. The warm scent of rotting wood. The distant aroma of boiled cabbage. The faint tang of mildew that never quite goes away. This was the perfume of home for thousands. Maybe millions. Romantic, if your idea of romance includes tetanus. And yet, people lived here. Slept here. Loved, fought, aged and died here. These creaking cages held entire lives inside their water-stained walls. Letters were written by candlelight. Secrets whispered through cracked doors. Bread was broken over crooked tables. Even in the rot, there was rhythm. Even in decay, a kind of dignity. Thomas, brushing against the splintered doorframe of his room, pauses to look up at a beam above the hearth. It's got initials carved into it. WH1721. Someone else once stayed here. Maybe they carved their name before leaving, or maybe they never left. Maybe they became part of the building, another ghost groaning in the timbers, another name swallowed by creak and rot. So yeah, breathe that in, dust and all. This house is alive in the way only old buildings can be. It breathes. It groans. It remembers. And tonight, it welcomes you. Just don't lean too hard on the banister. It's been temporary since when Thomas first stepped into his shared room, he expected bad. What he found was an experience. Not quite hell, but definitely somewhere in the same postal code. Because here's the thing about 1700s boarding houses. You didn't just rent a bed. You bought a front row seat to humanity at its most feral. His first roommate was already asleep, or unconscious, or possibly embalmed. A man of indeterminate age, face like a shriveled apple, and feet like smoked ham. One sock on, one sock missing, breathing in stutters, like his lungs were bargaining with time. He was curled in the corner bed, wrapped in a blanket that looked, and probably smelled like a boiled sheep. Thomas's own bed was directly beside him, 6 inches of polite distance between two strangers, neither of whom had the luxury of personal space. The mattress let out a resigned sigh as he sat. The other man didn't stir, just snored, deeply, rhythmically, like he was sawing through a pine log with his face. It only got better when the third roommate arrived. Enter William. Travelling salesman. Smelled like pickled onions and cheap gin. Dressed like a man who had slept in a pile of old laundry and lost the fight. His voice was loud, his opinions louder, and his shoes never came off. A blessing and a curse, depending on how one felt about foot-based airborne assaults. William greeted Thomas with a toothy grin. Half his teeth were missing. The other half wished they were. He slapped Thomas on the back like an old friend, and claimed the last bed by tossing a burlap sack onto it, and declaring, "Dibs." The sack moved slightly. Either he kept rats, or the rats kept him. So there they were. Thomas, tired and cautious. The mummified snorer, motionless and vaguely damp. And William, who had already begun an unsolicited monologue about the time he outran a constable in Bristol, wearing only a hat and a smile. No one asked questions. It was safer that way. And this wasn't unusual. In fact, it was the norm. You see, boarding houses in the 1700s were communal by design, but chaotic by nature. People from every walk of life were shoved into the same rooms, the same beds, the same fights over who got the side without the suspicious stain. A single room could contain an apprentice baker, a retired sailor, a widow with a mysterious past, and someone who claimed to have met Benjamin Franklin but pronounced it Frunklin. It was like living inside a Dickens novel, only everyone smelled worse and had scurvy. Let's talk hygiene, or rather the screaming absence of it. Bathing was not a nightly event. It wasn't even a weekly one. Some boarders went entire seasons without a proper wash. Cologne? Unheard of. Deodorant? A future dream. The most you could hope for was a faint whiff of pine tar if someone had brushed past a tree recently. Breath was another battlefield, with dental care ranging from non-existent to bite this rope. Many mouths were full of mysteries, and not the fun kind. Thomas quickly learned to sleep facing the wall, just to avoid the oral atmosphere drifting from William's open mouth. And the snoring. Oh, the snoring. Imagine a barnyard symphony, composed entirely of congested pigs and malfunctioning bellows. Now imagine that sound bouncing off uninsulated wooden walls at 2 a.m. That's what sleep sounded like in a shared room. And if someone had night terrors? Congratulations, you were now part of the cast. One man, years later, wrote in his journal that he once shared a bed with a man who screamed about dragons in his sleep every night for 3 weeks, and no one stopped him, because everyone else had their own dragons to wrestle. There were fights, of course, over blankets, over spilled ale, over who stole whose sausage. One traveller recalled a duel fought over a stolen pair of socks. Neither man won, but the floorboards never recovered. And theft, practically tradition. If you didn't chain your boots to the bedpost, you might wake up barefoot and betrayed. So how did people live like this? Simple. They had no choice. Wages were low, rents were high, and for the vast majority of workers, this was the only option that didn't involve sleeping in a doorway or bribing a cousin. Boarding houses were survival. Messy, loud, cramped survival. A roof over your head and a mattress under your back, no matter how stained or shared. Thomas, trying desperately to ignore William's rambling story about a haunted spoon, stared at the ceiling. He wondered what his life had become. He used to dream of owning a shop, printing important things, novels, pamphlets, maybe his own name in bold type. Now he just dreamed of silence. And yet, there was something oddly comforting in the noise. The creak of the floorboards, the rhythm of 3 different snores, the low murmur of voices through the wall. Like the house itself was humming with life. Tired, bitter, smelly life, but life all the same. Maybe that was the trick. You didn't sleep despite your roommates. You slept because, eventually, the exhaustion was stronger than the chaos. And because tomorrow, the same creaky circus would perform again. Would you be able to rest in a room like this? Could you fall asleep, knowing your bunkmate once stabbed a man over a ham? Thomas closes his eyes, the laughter fading into background noise. Beside him, the mummified snorer exhales with the weight of centuries. William belches, and the night rolls on. Let's start with a little imagination exercise. Picture your current bed, a sturdy frame, soft mattress, probably some combination of foam, coils, and the crushed dreams of failed mattress startups. Pillows that cradle your head like a cloud with emotional intelligence. A comforter that knows the value of warmth without suffocation. Clean sheets that smell like lavender and consumer debt. Now, burn it all to the ground. Because a bed in a 1700s boarding house wasn't so much a place of rest, as it was a padded apology, an apology made out of straw, mildew, and extremely cautious optimism. Thomas's bed, like most in Mrs. Greeley's establishment, was nothing more than a crude wooden frame, propping up a sack of stuffing that had seen things. The mattress itself, and I use that word under protest, was typically filled with straw, hay, or feathers if the landlord was feeling generous and ignoring how many of them were molting. Over time, those materials compressed into dense, lumpy pads that smelled suspiciously like livestock and sounded like crumpling paper when you moved, or screamed. There were no sheets. Not personal ones anyway. What passed for bedding was usually a rough woolen blanket, scratchy enough to exfoliate you in your sleep and absorbent enough to retain every odor you released. You didn't so much lie on the mattress as you merged with it, slowly becoming one lichen-like mass of man and fabric. In time, the bedding took on your shape and your sin. And the communal sheets. Yes, communal. Because in many lower-end boarding houses, linens were rotated. Not daily, not weekly, but somewhere between whenever the previous tenant died, and that one time a rich uncle visited. Laundering was expensive, water-intensive, and frankly optional, which meant that your bed had probably been used by 3 strangers, a traveling dog, and at least 1 illegal cheese vendor before you showed up. Now, let's talk pillows. Or, more accurately, cloth sacks stuffed with regret. The average 18th century pillow could be filled with whatever was handy. Feathers, old rags, horsehair, dried moss, or even curled wood shavings. The result was less supportive neck cushion, and more bag of mildly aggressive discomfort. Some were so firm, they doubled as footstools, others flattened into nothing the moment your head touched them, a vanishing act of truly dismal proportions. Thomas had 1 pillow. He didn't know what was in it. He didn't want to know. He just knew it made a faint crinkling sound when squeezed and smelled faintly of boiled carrots. And then there were the bedfellows you didn't see. Bedbugs, fleas, lice, the unholy trinity of historical bedding. These weren't rare pests, they were standard features like cup holders in a car. You didn't ask if there were bugs, you asked how bad the bites would be. Some tenants carried their own powder or herbs to sprinkle on the mattress. Rosemary, lavender, powdered sulfur, which did little except give your infestation a light seasoning. At night, as Thomas lay down, he could feel the subtle tickle of movement under the blanket. Maybe it was his imagination. Maybe it was Jeremy the fungus, saying hello from below. Maybe it was something else. Either way, he learned quickly to tuck the blanket in tight, sleep with his mouth closed, and never, ever look too closely at the seams. Now let's consider warmth. Most boarding house rooms weren't heated. Firewood was expensive, coal even more so, and if you weren't paying premium rates, and Thomas certainly wasn't, you got what the sun gave you. On especially cold nights, tenants would sleep fully clothed, layering coats and scarves on top of their bedding, and still wake up with frost in their hair. Some brought heated bricks wrapped in cloth to warm their feet. Others just accepted that they'd never feel their toes again. Ever tried falling asleep with chattering teeth and a frozen pillow? It's humbling. And yet, there was an odd sort of ritual to it. The way people folded their clothes carefully before bed, even when the floor was dirt. The way they fluffed their straw bundles with a practiced thump, pretending it made a difference. The way someone might hang a small trinket, a rosary, a ribbon, a miniature portrait on the wall beside their cot. Tiny gestures of humanity in a bed that had seen too much of it. Every mattress in that house had absorbed stories, and fluids, and secret. Thomas, for his part, tried not to think about it. He pulled his threadbare blanket up to his chin, rolled to the least stained side of the bed, and stared into the dark. The bed creaked once, loudly, as though objecting to the weight of his soul. He closed his eyes, and tried to think of better places. Softer pillows, fresh air, a mattress, not filled with hay that may or may not be moving independently. But the boarding house didn't care, the mattress didn't care, and neither did the bugs gently nesting in his elbow crease. Welcome to the 1700s. Sleep tight, and maybe don't scratch that itch. Nightfall in a 1700s boarding house did not bring peace. It brought volume. Forget your white noise machines, your ambient rain playlists, or your calming binaural beats. The true historical soundscape was more like a symphony of suffering performed by an orchestra of chaos, and everyone had a solo. Thomas lay still in bed, blanket up to his chin, eyes wide open, not from fear, exactly, more from overstimulation. Because the moment darkness fell, the house came alive, and not in a Disney dancing furniture kind of way, more like a haunted barn full of sick livestock, comforting. The snoring, for starters, began like a slow wave. One man in the next room groaning with deep, mucus-thick exhalations. Another, closer, emitting wheezes that sounded vaguely aquatic. Someone on the floor below whistled when they breathed. Not like a gentle tune, but like a dying kettle. And right beside Thomas, William, who snored with reckless, nasal abandon, pausing only to mutter something about card games and betrayal before rolling over and beginning again. But that was just the background music. Creaks were the lead vocals. Every plank of wood had a statement to make, from the subtle whisper of a flexing beam to the tortured shriek of a stair settling under unseen weight. The building offered constant reminders of its age and fragility. It didn't feel like the house was settling, it felt like the house was regretting. At exactly midnight, Thomas checked by candlelight, came a series of dull thuds from above, the attic, or maybe the roof. Possibly a raccoon. Hopefully a raccoon. Because if it wasn't an animal, then either the building was haunted, or someone up there had an extremely aggressive bedtime routine. Still, Thomas tried to relax. He closed his eyes, took a breath, and focused on the sound of the wind outside. Gentle, right? No. The wind found every crack and crevice in the warped windows, and howled through them like a banshee with performance anxiety. Drafts moved the curtains, if you had them, and sometimes made doors creak open just enough to be unsettling. It was the kind of night that made candle flames shiver and grown men whisper prayers. Then came the rats, in the walls, under the floor, occasionally on the floor, if someone dropped a biscuit. The rats were not shy, nor were they quiet. They scratched, clawed, and squeaked with the confidence of tenants who knew their rights. One particularly assertive specimen made nightly rounds across the ceiling beam in Thomas's room, pausing occasionally to stare down at him with judgment in its eyes. And it wasn't just rats. Boarding houses were democratic in their infestations. Mice, insects, the occasional stray cat that snuck in looking for warmth, all joined the midnight jamboree. The result was a tapestry of organic movement that made sleep less a destination and more a negotiation. Some nights brought arguments, heated, whispered, or shouted, about money, about stolen food, about whose turn it was to empty the chamber pot. Voices rose through the walls, carried on thin plaster and thinner patience. Sometimes a fist banged against a wall, sometimes a door slammed, and sometimes someone cried softly, muffled, short-lived, quickly silenced by embarrassment or exhaustion. There were more interpretive noises too. Moans that weren't illness-related, squeaks of furniture moving in rhythm, the unmistakable thud of something falling off a bed. Human intimacy was not easily hidden in shared quarters. Privacy was a luxury, discretion a myth. Thomas learned to stare at the ceiling and focus very hard on the sound of the wind, even when it wasn't the wind. And then, once in a while, came the silence. Not peaceful silence. Ominous silence. The kind that made your skin tighten and your ears strain, like the whole building was holding its breath. Those were the moments when Thomas wondered if someone had died, or if someone was dying, or worse, if someone was waiting. He wasn't alone in this paranoia. Sleep, in the 1700s, came with a healthy dose of fear. Fear of fire, especially a dropped candle, a kicked hearth log, and the whole building could go up like a tinderbox soaked in bacon grease. People slept with water buckets nearby. Some kept boots by the bed, just in case they had to run. There was also fear of theft. A soft shuffle in the dark might be your roommate looking for his blanket, or your boots, or both. Many tenants slept with their coin purses tucked into their shirts or tied to their ankles. Trust was rare, especially after dark. And, of course, fear of illness. One man's cough in the night could be your funeral invitation 2 weeks later. The sound of a hacking throat, a wet sneeze, or a wheeze that just didn't stop, could send cold chills down the spine of even the most seasoned lodger. Thomas turned to his side, pulling the blanket tighter. He tried not to breathe too deeply. The air was thick with dust, smoke, and possibly plague. His eyes adjusted to the darkness. A dim glow from the hallway seeped under the door. He could see the shadow of William's form rising and falling, hear the slow gurgle of breath. Somewhere outside a dog barked once, then went silent, and then he froze. Something skittered across his chest. Not large, not heavy, just swift. He didn't move, didn't breathe, listen. Silence. Then the slow, deliberate sound of tiny claws on wood, moving away. Was it real, or a trick of his sleep-deprived mind? He didn't know, but he stayed perfectly still until dawn. There are many words one could use to describe the 1700s boarding house bathroom situation. Convenient is not one of them. Fragrant, perhaps. Character building, if you're being generous. But mostly, it was a shared ritual of deeply undignified necessity. A performance in porcelain, if you will. Welcome to the chamber pot ballet. For the uninitiated, which lucky you, a chamber pot is a wide, shallow bowl, usually ceramic or metal, designed for one deeply unfortunate purpose: collecting bodily waste indoors. It was the toilet's great-great-grandparent, minus the plumbing, the privacy, and the hope. During the day, many lodgers used outhouses or public privies, if they existed nearby. But once night fell, you stayed inside. Not because it was safer, just less muddy. Thomas's chamber pot was placed under the bed, precisely where his foot found it on the first night. By accident, naturally. It was lukewarm, and not empty. He had questions, none of them had answers he wanted. Most rooms had one pot per 2 or 3 beds, depending on the landlord's generosity and your roommate's bladder control. That meant sharing. Yes, sharing. If that word just gave you a full-body shiver, congratulations, you're still human. The etiquette was unwritten, but fiercely enforced. Don't move the pot once it's placed. Don't overfill it. Always place the lid back on. And never, under any circumstances, try to make eye contact with someone while they're using it. There are few moments more humbling than squatting over a cold bowl in a room full of strangers while pretending this is normal. The nighttime routine followed a strange choreography. Step 1. Wake up, needing to go. Step 2. Lie in bed for 15 minutes trying to convince yourself you don't. Step 3. Give in, shuffle quietly across the freezing floor, try not to stub your toe on the firewood, and lift the lid as silently as possible. Step 4. Attempt your business in total darkness, while balancing awkwardly and whispering apologies to the pot, the house, and God himself. Now add stage fright, a growling stomach, a snoring roommate 6 inches away, and the constant fear that you might knock the thing over, which happened. Often, one traveler wrote about being awoken by the sound of a toppled pot, and the slow, spreading horror that followed. Carpets were rare, mops rarer. Of course, in better boarding houses, and by better, I mean marginally less terrifying, chamber pots were emptied by servants each morning. But in most, you were responsible for your own payload, which meant navigating narrow hallways, creaky stairs, and groggy strangers, while holding a literal bucket of excrement. And then came the disposal. At any given moment, the air outside a boarding house could be scented with the finest bodily odor chamber pot. In winter, the stench froze into silence. In summer, it danced through open windows like an unwanted house guest. It mingled with food smells, pipe smoke, unwashed bodies, and the occasional whiff of something vaguely corpse-adjacent. Inside, the scent lingered. No matter how many herbs you burned or windows you cracked open, the chamber pot's presence was always known. A faint background tang, like vinegar and despair. Thomas, for his part, adapted. He learned to breathe through his mouth when emptying the pot. He perfected the one-footed shuffle to avoid stepping in splash zones. He even learned to tell, by sound alone, which roommate was using it. A deeply unfortunate skill, but useful. One night, around 3 a.m., the pot reached maximum capacity. William, naturally, had ignored the rules. He'd gone twice before bedtime, and left the lid off. Thomas awoke to a wet squish as his stockinged foot found the puddle beneath. He stood there, blinking into the dark, weighing his options. Yell? Cry? Move to a monastery? Instead, he grabbed the nearest rag, wiped in silence, and muttered a quiet oath to the gods of indoor plumbing. Every single night. And somehow he got used to it. Humans are nothing if not adaptable, and mildly disgusting. The temperature inside a 1700s boarding house was a lot like a bad relationship, inconsistent, uncommunicative, and occasionally life-threatening. 1 minute, you were sweating through your underlayers. The next, you were shivering so hard your teeth played a Morse code solo against your molars. Climate control, in this context, meant sleeping in whatever position best minimized your exposure to frostbite. Let's start with the basics. There was no thermostat, no radiators, no forced air. If you wanted heat, you lit something on fire and hoped it didn't kill you. That something might be wood, if you had money, or coal, if you were bold, or if you were truly out of options, sticks, old newspapers, or your dreams of upward mobility. Fireplaces were common, yes, but not in every room, and even when present, they were less roaring hearth, and more sullen cough. A smouldering pile of embers in the corner wasn't warming a damn thing, except maybe the mouse nest behind it. And remember, firewood wasn't free. Most boarding house tenants either paid extra for it, or didn't get it at all. Thomas's room had no fireplace. It did have a cracked window pane that let in the breeze like an enthusiastic party guest who wasn't invited, and wouldn't leave. In the summer, this was fine. If you like the feeling of sleeping inside a baked potato wrapped in wool. In the winter, it was a wind tunnel of suffering. Which brings us to insulation. There wasn't any. Roofs leaked, walls leaked, windows leaked. And not just water, they leaked air, which is somehow worse when you're trying to sleep and your breath is condensing into icicles on the bed sheets. The buildings were drafty by design, constructed with gaps wide enough to see daylight through. You didn't just feel the outside, you practically lived there, emotionally. To stay warm, people got creative. Some layered every piece of clothing they owned, transforming into historical burritos with hats. Others relied on body heat, sleeping 2 or 3 to a bed, whether you were friends, strangers, or sworn enemies. At that point, you stopped caring who was next to you as long as they radiated 98.6 degrees and didn't kick. Thomas wore 3 shirts, a scarf, and wrapped his coat around his feet like a loyal dog. He tucked the ends of the blanket under his body to trap what little warmth his soul had left. Still, he could feel the cold reaching up from the floorboards, creeping into his bones with slow, deliberate intent. Some lodgers used warming pans, metal trays filled with hot coals, slid between the sheets before bedtime. But these came with hazards. One wrong move, and your mattress caught fire. There are records of entire homes burning down because someone sneezed on a warming pan. Toasty. And what about the cold, damp mornings? Nothing says start your day like stepping onto a floor so cold, it makes your toes question their existence. There was no hot shower to ease you awake, no warm slippers. You rolled out of bed, stiff and aching, into a room that felt like the inside of a snowman's armpit. Then you dressed in clothes that were still damp from yesterday's storm, buttoned up your stiff collar, and got ready to go outside, where it was somehow warmer than indoors. But let's not pretend summer was any better. Summer heat in a boarding house was a kind of slow-roasting agony. The wooden buildings trapped warmth like ovens, with no air conditioning or even the idea of a fan. You just simmered. People slept nude, or nearly so, laid wet cloths over their foreheads, or moved to the floor in search of a slightly cooler death. The smells multiplied. Sweat, mildew, whatever was cooking in the kitchen, or decomposing in the stairwell, mixed into a humid cocktail that clung to the walls like guilt. Windows were propped open, which let in marginal air and maximum insects, mosquitoes, flies, the occasional drunk bee. All of them treated your room like an all-inclusive buffet. And of course, the noise didn't stop. Hot nights meant more tossing, more turning, more arguing about who took the blanket when no one needed the blanket. Thomas often ended up sleeping on top of the covers, hoping his body would forget how to sweat. Let that sink in. There was no season in which the boarding house was comfortable. Winter stabbed you with ice needles. Summer boiled you in your own oils. Spring brought mold. Autumn delivered fleas. It was the full calendar of unpleasantness, delivered directly to your pillow. Modern comparison. Think camping in an abandoned barn, without a tent, during allergy season, surrounded by strangers with questionable hygiene, and no marshmallows. But humans, as always, adapt. They learn to sleep curled like question marks. They learn to breathe shallowly, to minimize the intake of musty air. They learn to sleep lightly, not because it was restful, but because they had to be ready to flee a fire, a thief, or the late-night return of that one roommate who sang when drunk. Thomas, after weeks in his chilly, creaky room, stopped noticing the cold. Not because it got warmer, it didn't, but because his body gave up. Numb became normal. When you're tired enough, your standards stop complaining. And so, night after night, he laid in that crooked bed, wrapped in every piece of clothing he owned, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks, and wondering, not for the first time, whether he'd ever be warm again. In the boarding house, the line between dreaming and waking was as thin as the wall between you and the couple arguing about cheese storage. 2 rooms over. Sleep didn't bring rest. It brought visions, some strange, some terrifying, some just deeply, deeply inconvenient. Welcome to the dreamscape of the 1700s, a place where even your subconscious was probably haunted. Let's set the stage. Thomas, exhausted, finally falls asleep. His limbs ache, his breath fogs the air, and his last thought before drifting off is, "Please, no rats tonight." But rest doesn't mean safety, at least not here, because dreams, in the 18th century, weren't benign little film reels of your day. They were portals, punishments, warnings from beyond, and sometimes apologies from a very confused brain. He dreams he's in a church, alone, but the pews are full of shadowy figures with no faces. He's barefoot. He's cold. He's holding a chamber pot. The bells toll, but no one moves. Then something growls beneath the altar. He wakes up sweating. William's snoring. That was the first hour. See, people in the 1700s understood nightmares as more than bad dreams. They were messages, omens, punishments for sin, or signs of spiritual disturbance. And considering everyone was either hungry, sick, malnourished, grieving, or sleeping in a lice-infested mattress, it's no wonder the unconscious mind got a little dramatic. There was even a name for a specific kind of terror, the old hag. This wasn't just a folk tale. It was an experience widely reported in Europe and colonial America. Waking in the middle of the night, unable to move, feeling a crushing weight on your chest. The explanation, a malicious spirit sitting on your ribs. The modern diagnosis, sleep paralysis. But back then, that was a witch, my friend. A witch with no chill. People described seeing her in great detail. Old, shriveled, silent, sometimes with wild hair, sometimes with glowing eyes. She didn't speak. She just stared, or leaned closer, or breathed into your ear while your body screamed internally. Now, picture waking up in a freezing room, in total darkness, beside two strangers and one mysterious fungus colony. You can't move. The shadows in the corner seem to breathe. The snoring has stopped. Did someone else wake up? Did something else arrive? Thomas had one such episode, his second week in the house. He remembered the stillness, the pressing weight, the flicker of candlelight where no candle was burning. When he could move again, he lay there for hours, wide-eyed, unsure if it had been a dream or an unwelcome visit. These experiences weren't rare. In fact, they were so common that boarding house gossip often included dream analysis. Mary says she saw her dead husband again, someone might whisper over breakfast. Says he told her to stop letting the dog in the pantry. The message was unclear. The concern was real. And it wasn't just sleep paralysis. Fever dreams were another feature. With so many residents crammed into tight, unsanitary spaces, illness spread quickly. A simple cold could spiral into bronchitis. A scratch could fester. And when fever hit, the dreams that followed were less whimsical subconscious escapades and more hallucinatory dread sequences. People dreamed of fire, of floods, of being buried alive, of teeth falling out in endless streams, of babies crying in walls, of rats talking to them, and sometimes of nothing at all, just endless blackness, heavy and eternal, with the vague sense that something just out of reach was watching. Let that sink in. Dreaming, for many, wasn't escape. It was just another room in the house, darker, stranger, but no more private than the one they slept in. Your subconscious had roommates too, and they didn't knock. It didn't help that religion added extra layers of anxiety. The devil, they believed, worked hardest at night. Sin thrived in the dark. Temptation arrived in dreams. And if you dreamed of flesh, lust, or temptation, well, that was practically a confession. Better say your prayers twice, just in case the dream shows up again with more details. And sometimes, it wasn't even your dream. Boarding houses meant shared space, which meant shared noise, which meant someone else's night terror became your midnight panic attack. Thomas once awoke to William yelling in his sleep. Something about drowning in gravy, though his accent made it hard to tell. Another lodger down the hall screamed nightly at roughly 2:13 a.m. No one knew why. No one asked. You just rolled over and tried to find the quiet between shrieks. Sleepwalking was another fun addition. Not uncommon in a time when trauma, malnutrition, and chronic illness were standard features of adulthood. More than one resident woke to find someone standing over them, eyes open, not seeing. Again, no one asked questions. Boarding house rule and 4. Mind your business, especially at 3 a.m. Thomas overheard a conversation one morning between two older men arguing whether the boarded-up room on the 3rd floor was cursed or just mouldy. The consensus, both. Thomas, lying in bed that night, wrapped in blanket and fear, stared into the dark. The dreams would come. They always did. Some strange, some terrifying, some not dreams at all. He closed his eyes and waited. There's a special kind of despair that only arrives in the early morning. before the sun rises, before your body is ready, before your dignity has located its boots. And in a 1700s boarding house, waking up wasn't just unpleasant. It is an act of willpower, poor judgment, and biological betrayal. You didn't rise and shine, you slid and winced. Thomas blinked awake to the familiar sting of cold air against every uncovered inch of skin. His nose, red and slightly crusted, confirmed the room was still as cold as a debtor's heart. The blanket, which had been barely adequate all night, had migrated somewhere near his knees. He didn't remember kicking it off, but then again, he also didn't remember sleeping. Not well, anyway. Beside him, William snored peacefully. One arm flopped over the edge of the bed like a discarded ham. The third roommate, the human radiator known as Elias, was already gone. Judging by the faint wet footprint trails on the floor, he'd ventured off barefoot again. Brave, foolish, probably both. Thomas sat up slowly. Every joint protested. His spine crackled like a thatch roof in the sun. He ran a hand through his hair and encountered the unmistakable texture of overnight sweat, dried into crunchy defiance. His mouth tasted like regret, dust, and possibly cabbage. Welcome to Morning Breath, 18th century edition. No toothpaste, no mouthwash, just your own fermented bacteria kicking off their day. Tooth care was, at best, enthusiastic guesswork. Most people used cloth rags, chewed twigs or tooth sticks to scrape off whatever was growing on their enamel. Some used salt, others used ash. A few just rinsed with water and hoped for the best. Toothpaste as we know it didn't exist yet, though a few apothecaries offered gritty mint-adjacent pastes that tasted like despair and rabbit bone. Thomas had a rag. He also had some salt. He rubbed them together, gagged a little, and spit into the chamber pot with quiet resignation. Grooming wasn't a ritual. It was damage control. There were no mirrors in most rooms, and no one cared if your hair was combed. Only that it didn't contain visible wildlife. Razors, if you had one, were used sparingly. Soap, if you were lucky enough to afford it, was shared and looked like a bar of beige mystery. Often the most anyone did in the morning was splash cold water on their face and call it survival. Still, there was a hierarchy of hygiene. Apprentices and clerks usually made an effort. Travelers tried harder, especially if trying to impress someone downstairs. But laborers, drunkards, and the perpetually disheartened, they embraced the musk. Downstairs, the boarding house kitchen was stirring, not with enthusiasm, more with inevitability. The smell of something boiling, possibly oats, possibly last week's bones, drifted up the stairwell. Breakfast was served at a long table, already surrounded by bleary-eyed tenants scratching various parts of themselves and attempting basic conversation. The meal, if you could call it that, was functional. Porridge, thin and tepid. Bread, yesterday's and proudly stale. Maybe a slice of cheese if the rats hadn't beaten you to it. Butter was rare. Eggs were mythical. Coffee was weak and mostly chicory. Tea existed, but mostly in dreams or the possessions of wealthier lodgers who guarded their leaves like treasure. Thomas sat between a shoemaker with a hacking cough and a washerwoman already elbow-deep in gossip. He nodded. He chewed. He tried not to inhale too deeply. The porridge tasted like sadness and wood ash. The bread required effort. The company, while technically human, radiated the energy of people still halfway between nightmare and day labor. Still watching? Still conscious? Then you know what to do. Like, comment, or subscribe. It's less painful than scraping your tongue with a salt rag. Back at the table, conversation wobbled along. One man complained about rats in the rafters. Another bragged about sleeping through someone else's night terrors. A woman in a faded bonnet recounted for the third time this week her dream about a talking goose who predicted the weather. No one questioned it. And in the background, the boarding house owner, Mrs. Greeley, banged pots together and muttered obscenities about people who left candle wax in her stairwell. Her hair was wrapped in a scarf. Her apron bore the stains of several centuries. Her glare could curdle milk. She was the closest thing the house had to God, and no one dared cross her before she'd had her tea. After breakfast, the Great Migration began. Men shoved on boots and belted coats. Women wrapped shawls over their shoulders and adjusted the hems of skirts that had seen better days, if not centuries. Children, yes. There were always a few running feral through the halls, were corralled by mothers or ignored entirely, depending on mood. Thomas returned to his room to gather his things. A satchel, a half-finished pamphlet draft, a lucky coin that wasn't all that lucky. The bed was unmade. The chamber pot still lingered beneath like a sad porcelain secret. The air smelled faintly of body heat and crushed dreams. He sighed. He wrapped his scarf tight. He prepared to face another day of typesetting, soot, and sore feet. But not before stepping, once again, on a splinter the size of a toothpick. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just nodded. Another morning in paradise. If you thought 1700s boarding houses were chaotic with just a bunch of snoring, lice-riddled men, allow me to introduce you to the full cast. Women, children, and the general messiness of domestic life when every square inch is rented, shared, or screamed over. Boarding houses weren't monasteries, they were microcosms of society, just louder, tighter, and infinitely more flammable. Thomas wasn't surprised to find women in the house. What did surprise him was just how many of them were in charge. Women like Mrs. Greeley, the landlady, judge, cook, and enforcer, ran these places with a wooden spoon in one hand and a ledger of grudges in the other. Widows, spinsters, and enterprising wives turned entire floors of their homes into income streams. They collected rent, mediated disputes, and made porridge that could stun a mule. But the tenants? That's where the chaos multiplied. Women of all kinds rented rooms. Seamstresses working from dawn till dusk. Servants between jobs, wives whose husbands were off to sea, or had simply vanished into history's shrug. And they didn't always come alone. Enter the children. Children in a boarding house were either invisible or omnipresent. The quiet ones hid under staircases or behind skirts, wide-eyed and grimy. The loud ones, you heard them at all hours, thumping across floorboards, shrieking over broken toys, or wailing because someone stole their turnip. Yes, a real fight once broke out over a turnip. The turnip lost. Thomas's room shared a wall with a family of 5. A mother, her elderly aunt, and 3 children under the age of coherence. The wall was thin. He could hear every lullaby, every scolding, every toddler tantrum executed at maximum lung capacity. He learned the names of the children before he met them. Eliza, who cried like an opera singer, George, who chewed furniture, and little Will, who giggled exclusively at night. Let that sink in. You're already sleeping on a straw mattress, in a cold room, surrounded by snoring drunks. And now a child is laughing, not during the day, at night, in the dark, with no other sound. Sleep well. Despite the noise, most boarders tolerated children. Why? Because no one had a choice. You lived among each other, like bacteria in a shared petri dish. You got used to the smell of diapers being boiled in the communal wash job. You accepted the sticky fingerprints on your boots. But women weren't just passive lodgers. They shaped the rhythm of the house. They woke first, cooked, cleaned, fetched water, managed children. Some took in laundry to pay rent, their hands raw from scrubbing and wringing. Others stitched late into the night by candlelight, their needles clicking like tiny metronomes of exhaustion. And, of course, there was gossip. The 1700s boarding house was not merely a shelter. It was a theatre of secrets, whispered scandal, and low-stakes espionage. Women swapped stories over bread crusts, traded rumours while brushing out each other's hair, and held court in kitchens where the steam never settled. Who owed rent? Who was hiding a pregnancy? Who was seen sneaking out after curfew? Mrs. Greeley always knew, even if she pretended not to. But it wasn't all camaraderie and conspiracies. The realities of being a woman in these spaces were grim. Safety was relative. Privacy was rare. A single lockless door stood between you and whatever the night decided to throw at you. Women slept with knives under their pillows. They placed chairs under doorknobs, and they taught their daughters, early and quietly, to recognize danger before it knocked. Boarding houses also saw their share of tragedy. Stillbirths, infections, accidents. A candle tipped over. A fever that never broke. The hallway fell silent for a day, maybe 2. Then the room was emptied, the mattress turned, and someone else moved in. Still, there were moments, brief flickering of joy. Children chasing each other around the laundry line in the courtyard. A mother humming while sewing. A girl laughing as her brother tried to dance with a broom. These tiny flickers of normality felt like rebellion against the grimness. Imagine raising a baby where you can't boil water without setting your house on fire, where illness waits in the walls, where the sound of a man vomiting down the hallway is your child's lullaby. That was life, and women carried it all, with cracked hands and exhausted smiles. They kept the boarding house running when the men were drunk, absent or dead. They mended shirts, hearts and community ties. They told stories by candlelight. They taught their children not just how to survive, but how to do it with a sliver of grace. As for Thomas, he developed a certain respect and fear for the women of the house, especially the one who once yanked William by the ear for swearing near her child. William didn't swear again, not in that hallway. So next time you think of the 1700s boarding house, don't picture just dusty beds and chamber pots. Picture the women who held the walls together, with bread dough on their elbows, hair falling out of pins, and eyes that missed nothing. They weren't just surviving, they were enduring. There's something sobering about lying in bed and wondering who died in it last. Not if, who, because in a 1700s boarding house, death wasn't rare, shocking or poetic. It was routine. It showed up like rent day, uninvited, inconvenient, and always just a little too soon. Thomas had begun to suspect his mattress had a past. It wasn't the stains though, yes, they existed. It was the feeling, a heaviness in the stuffing, a memory in the springs, or straw, or whatever unfortunate mixture filled the lump beneath him. Something about the way it creaked, not just with weight but with memory, like it heard final words, like it remembered lungs rattling closed. He wasn't wrong. Boarding houses were places of high turnover. People arrived, they lived, they left, and sometimes they didn't leave at all. Illness swept through the halls like gossip, only deadlier. One cough, one fever, one infected wound, and suddenly a room became a shrine. Briefly, then it became rentable again. Tuberculosis, then called consumption, was the silent killer of the era. It took its time. It wore people down with soft hands and hard lungs, pale cheeks, wet coughs, red-streaked handkerchiefs. The symptoms were unmistakable, and the sound of someone coughing through the night was less a nuisance and more a grim countdown. Rooms weren't quarantined. People just moved their beds a few inches away, and Thomas once watched as two men quietly carried a body wrapped in a quilt out of a second-floor room. No announcement, no morning procession, just a slow descent down the stairs and out the back door. The bed frame was wiped down, the mattress turned, and by nightfall, another man had moved in. Business was business. Cholera was worse. It struck fast, violently, and often publicly. Stomach cramps, vomiting, diarrhea that made the chamber pots scream for mercy. In a house with limited sanitation and many shared items, the disease moved like fire. If one tenant had it, everyone was on borrowed time. Entire floors emptied in days. And yet, life went on. Let that sink in. You could sleep in a bed, and the next morning wake up fine, or not wake up at all. You might lean against a wall where someone once leaned during their last breath. You might borrow a blanket that once covered a cooling body. The proximity to death wasn't poetic. It was practical. Death certificates weren't a thing. Neither were autopsies. In most cases, a doctor, if one could be afforded, might visit, nod sagely, mutter about vapors, and leave. The body was someone else's problem. Often, boarding house owners handled removals with all the ceremony of taking out the trash. A few coins might be deducted from the deceased's remaining belongings to cover expenses, or not. Who was going to argue? Still, some deaths lingered longer. One tenant, years before Thomas arrived, had died of what was politely referred to as melancholy. A rope, a beam, a note, written in shaky Latin. The landlady burned the paper and never spoke of it again, but the room stayed empty for weeks. Tenants whispered, claimed they heard creaking at night, claimed they smelled smoke when no candle was lit. That room eventually reopened at a discount. And it wasn't just illness. Accidents happened. Fires, falls, fights. A man once slipped on the stairs during a storm and broke his neck. No railing, no witnesses. He was found the next morning, his face twisted, one boot halfway off. They moved the body, mopped the blood, and by sundown, A carpenter was hammering the stair back into place. Even childbirth, if you'll recall from the previous chapter, was a game of survival. No hospitals, no sterile rooms, just a midwife, few towels, a bowl of water, and luck. If a woman survived, she was considered strong. If the baby survived, a miracle. If both did, unheard of. And yet, death didn't stop the world. Rent was still due. Breakfast was still served. The bed still needed to be filled, preferably by someone alive, because a vacant bed meant lost income. And in a house where every penny counted, sentimentality wasn't profitable. Thomas once asked Mrs. Greeley, cautiously, whether she ever kept track of who died in which rooms. She gave him a look that could curdle wax and said simply, "The ones who paid are buried, the ones who didn't are forgotten." And that was that, but the truth lingered. He couldn't stop thinking about it. Every creak of the bed frame, every cough echoing down the hallway, every faint stain that resisted scrubbing, it all whispered of lives lived and ended right where he laid his head. He found himself sleeping lighter, dreaming darker, listening harder. Would you sleep in a dead man's bed? If it was the only one available. Thomas didn't have a choice. None of them did. Death was a roommate. Quiet, efficient, and always paid in full. The first thing that hit you when entering a 1700s boarding house wasn't the cold. It wasn't the noise, or even the visual horror of the wallpaper trying to detach itself from reality. No, the first thing that hit you, like a punch in the sinuses, was a full-bodied, aggressive, ever-present aroma, one that didn't ask permission, one that didn't leave. Thomas noticed it on his first day. The moment he stepped over the threshold, a thick miasma of boiled starches, wet wool, pipe smoke, chamber pot echoes, and something indefinably human. Not unpleasant in a fragrant way, unpleasant in the way old dishwater is unpleasant, or the inside of a retired shoe. It clung to everything. His coat, his hair, the fibers of his satchel. History, it turns out, has a scent, and it is not pine fresh. You see, when ventilation is poor and deodorant doesn't exist, your building becomes a terrarium for every odor that's ever entered it. People didn't bathe daily. They didn't launder clothes often. Kitchens didn't vent, and windows were more decorative suggestions than functional tools. So, smells, much like tenants, moved in and never left. Let's break it down. Body odor was the baseline. Everyone had it. Not in a malicious way, just in a permanent, I own one shirt, and I've worn it since harvest kind of way. Men smelled like sweat, leather, smoke, and the general musk of physical labor. Women smelled like starch, soap remnants, and the iron will of someone who hasn't slept in 6 days. Cooking odors layered themselves over that. Imagine every meal ever made in that building. Porridge, onions, stewed cabbage, salted fish. Now imagine all those smells compressed into the fabric of the curtains. That's what greeted your nose at breakfast. It wasn't just the new food, it was the food from 3 Tuesdays ago, still clinging to the ceiling beams like a ghost of dinners past. Smoke was another constant. Pipes, hearths, candles, lanterns. The boarding house was a slow-burning inferno of tobacco and soot. The walls were stained yellow, not with paint but with years of smoke hugging every surface, and not the sweet, rich aroma modern cigar lounges try to romanticize. This was acrid, sour, slightly oily smoke, the kind that makes your eyes sting and your pillow crunch. Dampness added another special note. Rain leaked in. Steam from cooking never left. Laundry was hung indoors. Result, a persistent mildew funk. Mold lived rent-free in the corners, thriving in damp pockets behind furniture. Every breath was a gamble, every whiff a potential fungal engagement. Then, of course, there was the chamber pot effect. Even when emptied, they lingered. The smell clung to the pots, the air, the floorboards, your will to live. Combine that with infrequent floor scrubbing, and the occasional oops spill, and you've got an aromatic undercurrent that curled your nose hairs like a startled hedgehog. Now add in the people themselves. One tenant always wore cloves, not because he liked the scent, but because someone told him it masked the odor of feet. It didn't. Another woman insisted on dabbing vinegar behind her ears for freshness. She smelled like a walking salad. William, of course, bathed once a month and swore by his natural musk. Thomas swore at his natural musk. Imagine living in a hot yoga studio where no one showers, ever. That's your modern comparison. Same density, same humidity, just fewer downward dogs and more despair. Still, the worst smells were the ones you couldn't name. That sweet, sickly note near the back stairs, the metallic tang by the pantry, the sudden, unplaceable funk wafting from beneath a floorboard that no one had touched in years. Every house had its secrets, and many of them reeked. Mrs. Greeley did her best, bless her soul. She lit bundles of dried lavender. She sprinkled ashes with mint. She opened the windows on dry days. But masking the smell of centuries is like spraying perfume on a compost heap. A valiant effort. Entirely futile. And yet, people adapted. Noses dulled. Tolerance built. You stopped smelling it after a few days. Not because it went away, but because your brain waved a white flag and gave up. Thomas began to associate certain smells with specific rooms. The smell of boiled turnips meant the kitchen was free. The scent of burning fat meant the attic stove had caught fire again. The whiff of lilac, that meant someone had died, the only time Mrs. Greeley bothered with actual flowers. Let that settle for a second. Smell wasn't just background noise. It was narrative. A sensory history of every tenant, every meal, every illness. You could sniff the wall and guess the year. The smell told you who was home, who was fighting, who had company. It was gossip through the nose. And in a strange way, it was comforting. Because in all its unpleasantness, it was alive. The house was alive. It breathed. It fermented. It festered. And in doing so, it bore witness to the strange, stubborn persistence of the people inside. Thomas, stepping outside one morning, took a deep breath of fresh air, real air, unscented by humanity's various expulsions. He exhaled, blinked, and, for a moment, missed the sting, just a little. Not everything in a 1700s boarding house was horror and mildew. Sure, most of it was. The rats, the rashes, the omnipresent threat of someone else's foot in your chamber pot. But even in the middle of that grim daily grind, people found ways to cope, to steal joy, to escape, if only for a moment. And it's in these tiny rebellions, these little luxuries and whispered pleasures, that we remember the most important historical truth of all. Humans are really, really good at not losing their minds. Thomas, despite his grim surroundings, began to notice these quiet comforts. They were everywhere if you knew where to look. A girl humming while darning a sock. A man carving initials into a stair rail with the focus of an artist. A landlady sneaking the last bit of sugar into her tea, even though it was rationed and meant for guests. Small acts of indulgence in a world that otherwise smelled like cabbage and hopelessness. For Thomas, his escape was paper. Ink-stained fingers and all, he kept a journal. Not because he had anything especially profound to say, but because writing helped him survive the noise. After dinner, when the house buzzed with gossip and cutlery and coughing, he'd sit on the back steps, scratching lines onto a frayed page with a stub of pencil, observations, lists, hopes, once, a poem, but we don't talk about that. Liquor was the most obvious escape. Rum, gin, ale, smuggled, bartered, brewed in places that absolutely violated fire safety and common sense. A sip before bed was common. A swig before conversation. Expected. A full flask before breakfast. Concerning but not uncommon. Let's not forget food. Yes, most meals were thin soups and dry bread, but occasionally, especially when someone came into unexpected coin, treats appeared. A piece of fruit. A wedge of sharp cheese. Candied ginger saved in a pocket. One woman baked little hand pies with leftover scraps and refused to say what was in them. No one cared. They were warm. Sometimes, a tenant got mail, a letter from home, folded carefully, smelled of wax and unfamiliar perfume. The recipient would read it slowly, privately, then reread it aloud to a trusted neighbor. It didn't matter what it said. The words were from outside, and that was enough to make the boarding house feel a little less like purgatory. Some people found escape in faith. Tiny crucifixes hung above beds, psalms scribbled into the margins of old books. One tenant knelt beside his bed every night and whispered prayers into the chamber pot. Not for irony, but because it was the only quiet place in the room. God, one assumed, understood the effort. Others found comfort in companionship, a shared blanket, a whispered story, an accidental foot touch beneath the table that lingered just a second too long. Love, or something pretending to be love, existed here too, amid the grime, amid the noise. Not clean, not romantic, but real. Let that settle for a moment. Because even in the middle of squalor, surrounded by decay and discomfort, people still laughed, still hoped, still found joy in the utterly mundane. A warm cup, a quiet moment, a joke about someone's truly terrible snoring. These weren't grand escapes, these were survival mechanisms disguised as ordinary life. Thomas once spent an entire afternoon helping a boy search for a lucky button he'd lost in the cracks of the floorboards. They never found it, but by the end, the boy was laughing, and Thomas had forgotten for just a little while that he lived in a mildew-scented tinderbox with unreliable plumbing. Even Mrs. Greeley, steel-hearted and eternally scowling, had her vices. She played cards alone in the kitchen late at night, muttering to herself, as if someone was sitting across from her. One night, Thomas swore he saw her smile. Not wide, not long, but real. These moments didn't change the conditions. The straw bed still poked. The chamber pot still lurked. The air still hinted at ancient cheese. But they softened things. They reminded tenants that they were more than just renters of rotting space. They were people, with stories, with wants, with nerves held together by spit and community. Even in the darkest, dirtiest corners of history, people still found joy. Not in castles, not in carriages, but in little luxuries and tiny escapes. There were no guest surveys, no Yelp reviews, no 18th century equivalent of rate your stay out of 5 powdered wigs. But if there had been, the real stars of any halfway functioning boarding house would have been the ones no one wanted to be, but everyone relied on: the keepers, the caretakers, the reluctant landlords and landladies, who kept the whole creaky ship from sinking into full anarchy. In most boarding houses that meant one person, the owner. And in Thomas's case, her name was Margaret Greeley. Now, Mrs. Greeley wasn't what you'd call warm, or inviting, or even particularly fond of humans. But she was efficient. She ran the boarding house the way a prison warden might run a particularly flammable penitentiary, with vigilance, a thick apron, and zero tolerance for nonsense. She was somewhere in her 60s, maybe 70s, with the sort of posture that said, "I've buried 2 husbands and 3 rats this week." She didn't smile often, but when she did, it was usually because someone had just fallen down the stairs and learned a valuable lesson about not sprinting indoors. Margaret rose before dawn and moved like a storm through the halls. She banged on doors, she lit fires, she shouted breakfast warnings with the efficiency of a military drill sergeant, and everyone, man, woman, child, rat, respected her, not because they liked her, but because she could end you with a broom and not blink. Once a drunk sailor stumbled in past curfew and knocked over a chamber pot on the stairwell. By the time Thomas got downstairs, Margaret had already chased him 3 blocks with a Bible in one hand and a dented ladle in the other. He didn't come back. But Margaret was just one of many like her. All across cities and towns, women, usually widows, kept boarding houses running, not out of passion, but out of sheer necessity. With no husband to provide, limited options for income, and mouths to feed, they turned their homes into havens. Chaotic, smelly, overpopulated havens, but havens nonetheless. These women cooked, cleaned, mended, collected rent, brokered peace, buried the occasional body, and balanced their books with a precision that would terrify modern accountants. They knew everything about everyone: who skipped rent, who snuck out windows, who cried at night, who was sleeping with whom. And when you live in a house held together by mold and secrets, information is power. Landladies also mediated the kind of arguments that could end with someone losing a tooth. Fights over blankets, over food, over borrowed shirts, over who used the last of the soap water. Margaret had a wooden spoon for small disputes, and a cast-iron skillet for larger ones. Both were polished from use. Now, on paper, there were rules. Most boarding houses had a list posted somewhere, often handwritten in barely legible scrawl and pinned to a crooked wall. Rules like, no loud noise after sundown, no visitors after curfew, no swearing at the breakfast table, no fighting with firewood, no pigs upstairs. An actual rule from an actual house, but in reality, Enforcement depended on the temperament of whoever ran the place. Some keepers were lenient, distracted old men who smoked too much and looked the other way. Others were tyrants who fined you for breathing wrong. Margaret, she was fair, but firm. She ran a tight, terrifying ship, the kind where you paid rent on time, and thanked her for the privilege. Occasionally landladies employed help, a niece, a distant cousin, a neighbour's daughter. These girls ran errands, hauled coal, scrubbed floors, paid in pennies and praise. They became the silent machinery behind the boarding house's operation. They overheard everything, said nothing, observed everyone, missed nothing. One such girl, Annie, barely 15, worked under Margaret and moved like smoke, slipping in and out of rooms with water buckets and towels, collecting dirty dishes, returning with clean ones, occasionally stopping to feed the cat who wasn't technically allowed indoors. Annie didn't speak much, but when someone tried to skip out on rent, she was the first to let Margaret know. Quietly, directly, with the simple, terrifying phrase, "He's packing." And yet, for all their control, landladies weren't invincible. They were women in a world that still measured their worth by who they married, or buried. They fought illness, fought loneliness, fought a dozen ungrateful tenants and one collapsing chimney every winter, and somehow they kept going. Let that breathe for a moment, because while it's easy to focus on the gross bits, the lice, the leaking roofs, the atmospheric despair, there was real strength in these women, real defiance. They carved out power in places where women weren't meant to have any. They held dominion over creaking staircases and sweaty men and children, with sticky hands. They did it without applause, without breaks, without even the luxury of a locked door. Mrs. Greeley, for all her gruffness, was a survivor, a woman who turned her grief into business, her home into income, her sorrow into control, and behind that hard glare and dented ladle was someone who remembered every name, every debt, and every kindness, quietly. Thomas once left a few extra coins on the mantel after a particularly warm dinner. She didn't say a word, but the next morning his porridge came with a bit of honey. No explanation, no eye contact, just noticed. So next time we talk about the architecture of the past or the culture of the era, remember this: boarding houses didn't run on firewood and rent alone. They ran on women, with spoons and secrets. If you thought 1700s boarding house misery was exclusive to soggy corners of England or colonial New England, think again. The fine tradition of communal sleeping, minimal hygiene, and maximum discomfort was a truly global pastime. Every culture had its own version of cram as many tired humans as possible into a small space and hope no one dies by morning. Turns out, we're not so different after all. Just equally bad at personal space. Let's start in Edo period Japan, where urban density met a cultural emphasis on restraint. Boarding arrangements called nagaya, literally long houses, were common among the working class. These were single-story wooden row houses, often with multiple families under one roof, sharing a central corridor, one toilet, and all the ambient tension that comes with 3 generations of swordsmiths living elbow to elbow. Privacy was virtually non-existent. Sliding paper doors, separated rooms, meaning you could hear everything. Arguments, bedtime stories, farts. Cooking was done communally, often over charcoal stoves that filled the air with smoke and made everyone smell like barbecue. And sleep? Sleep happened on the floor, on thin futons, rolled out and rolled up daily to save space. It was tidy. It was compact. It was still absolutely miserable in the summer. Now hop over to Paris, where in the 18th century, attic rooms known as chambres de bonne were the staple of students, servants, and anyone too poor to afford an address below the 3rd floor. These were tiny, sometimes as small as 6 square meters, and frequently accessible only by separate staircases that also doubled as smoke chutes. The French boarding house experience was a little more refined, in the way that a burned croissant is still technically French. Beds were small, ceilings were low, and walls were thin enough that one enthusiastic sneeze could startle 4 neighbors. Tenants often shared chamber pots and meals, a pairing that, no matter how you sequence it, is always questionable. Meanwhile, in India, colonial rule and dense urban centers made communal living a necessity. In places like Calcutta, mess houses became the go-to for bachelor clerks working for the British East India Company. These were a curious mix of Victorian pretension and tropical surrender. starched sheets in a humid room, fans operated by string, and meals that tried very hard to be continental and failed gloriously. Indian boarding houses also functioned as social hubs. Political ideas, religious arguments, bad poetry, it all fermented in these dimly lit quarters over weak tea and strong curry. And while many locals had their own centuries-old traditions of communal living, such as joint family systems, the British boarding house model added new layers of bureaucracy and indigestion. Swing over to West Africa, where boarding houses took the form of compounds, extended family dwellings or community spaces where sleeping quarters were divided more by status and relation than architecture. Here, communal sleeping was both functional and cultural. People slept close, shared resources, and looked after each other's children. There was noise, of course, goats, drums, laughter, but also rhythm. Life lived together, without apology. Then there's China, where in cities like Guangzhou and later Shanghai, population booms created a market for tenement-style dormitories. Multiple families might rent corners of a single room. Kitchens were shared, walls were cloth partitions, and if you were lucky, your mattress was slightly less damp than your neighbor's. Fire was a constant danger. So were landlords who disappeared with your deposit. Even in Russia, communal living had its moment, long before the Soviet communal apartments of the 20th century. In 18th century Moscow and St. Petersburg, large estates were split up and rented out to boarders. Students, soldiers, minor bureaucrat. The winters were brutal, the stoves were inadequate, and the conversations were often philosophical, because despair and Dostoevsky go hand in hand. So why does this matter? Because discomfort was, and is, universal. From the straw pallets of an Edinburgh boarding cellar to the futons of a Tokyo alley home, the core experience was the same. Too many people, not enough space, and absolutely zero boundaries. But within that misery a pattern emerges. Every culture found ways to cope, to adapt, to build rituals within the chaos, to carve out moments of autonomy inside rooms filled with noise. In Japan, it was neatness and order. In France, routine and ritual. In West Africa, shared responsibility. In India, community debate. In England and America, passive-aggressive grumbling and porridge. Modern connection? Maybe we never stopped sleeping like this. Sure, you've got walls now. A mattress that came in a suspiciously small box. Air conditioning. But how many of us still live in shared apartments, dormitories, micro-housing pods? How many of us still hear our neighbors argue through the wall and pretend we don't? How many still long for silence we can't afford? The dorm rooms, the shared bunkhouses, the capsule hotels, even the open office nap pods. We've just repackaged communal suffering into something with mood lighting and subscription-based fire insurance. Let that sink in. Your fancy co-living startup with recycled wood countertops? Not so different from Mrs. Greeley's rat trap with decorative mildew. Just swap the musket for a podcast mic. History doesn't just repeat itself. It snores loudly through a curtain in the bed next to you. Old buildings remember things. Not in the poetic, if these walls could talk kind of way. More in the these walls won't shut up kind of way. Creaks in the night. Groans from floorboards. A chill through the window pane when no wind's blowing. Boarding houses, especially the ones from the 1700s, weren't just structures. They were record keepers, and their archives were stored in splinters and silence. Thomas had stayed in Mrs. Greeley's boarding house long enough that he started to hear it, the voice beneath the noise. Not literal words, not quite, but a rhythm, a weight, a presence, like the house had been watching all this time, and remembering, because that's what old houses do. They hold on to things. The stain in the hallway where a pot of stew fell and scalded a tenant in 1738, the nick in the banister from a sailor's belt buckle, the handprints on the back of a door frame where two lovers argued, or made up, or both. Every crack, every wobble, every warped panel has a story behind it. And in a boarding house where stories collided daily, the house became saturated with memory. The floorboard outside Thomas's room squeaked twice, once when stepped on, and once a half-second later, as if to say, yes, I noticed. That same board had been stepped on by 100 other boots. Bare feet, heeled shoes, crawling children. It bore them all, and remembered them. Above him, in the attic, a beam was etched with initials, JL 7062. Below them, AR 1774. Small, shallow cuts made by pocket knives or rusted nails. The desperate scratchings of people who wanted to say, "I was here," even if history had no interest in remembering them. The echoes weren't always audible. Sometimes they came in scent, a hint of tobacco when no one was smoking, or in light, a reflection on the wall that didn't match any window, or just a feeling, that tingle in your spine as you passed a closed door, the urge to look over your shoulder while washing your face. The sudden certainty that someone somewhere had walked this same hallway with the exact same thought 200 years ago. It wasn't ghosts. Not really. It was residue. Human residue. Not blood or grime, though there was plenty of that too, but emotional residue. Fear, longing, hope, despair. Boarding houses were vessels, and humans are messy passengers. One night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He wandered the halls, barefoot, candle in hand. The wood was cool beneath his feet, the air thick with that ever-present boarding house stew of soot and sour laundry. He passed closed doors and tried not to think about who had lived or died behind them. Then he reached the third floor. The third floor was quiet. Always had been. Fewer tenants. More creaks. Older paint. He found himself at the end of the hallway, staring at a closed door he'd never opened. Not locked. Just untouched. On impulse he reached for the knob. Turned it. Inside was nothing extraordinary. A narrow cot. A chair. A window with a view of the alley. Dust and sunbeams. But something about it felt heavier, like the air hadn't moved in decades. He stepped in. The floor groaned like a warning. He noticed a small item on the windowsill. A clay pipe. Broken at the tip. Forgot. He didn't take it. He didn't need to. Its presence was enough. A man once sat here, smoked that pipe, looked out at that same alley, maybe thinking of home, maybe thinking of leaving, maybe thinking of nothing at all, and then he left, or didn't, and the pipe stayed, a marker, a whisper. Back downstairs, Thomas lay in bed, and listened to the groans of beams, the coughs of strangers, the silence between. He thought about all the people who had occupied that same space before him, not just in his room, but in his bed, his spot, maybe even his exact sleeping position. What were their names? What had they wanted? Where had they gone? The house didn't answer, but it felt the question. Let that sit for a moment, because we often think of history as something outside us, a list of kings, a battle on a map, a crumbling castle we tour on holiday. But really, history is just people, like us, sleeping in cramped rooms, wondering about the future, leaving pipes behind on windowsills. Their stories didn't end because they weren't written down, they just soaked into the wood. Boarding houses weren't meant to last forever. Most have rotted, collapsed or been demolished to make way for luxury flats with granite countertops and no soul. But the few that remain, the ones still leaning into the street like they're telling secrets, carry centuries of noise, memory, and quiet resistance. And, in that sense, Thomas's room was never just his. It was borrowed, just like every room before it, just like every room now. So next time you're in an old building, take a moment. Press your palm against the wall, listen for the faint echo in the floorboards. You won't hear words, but you might hear presence. History doesn't knock. It creaks. It was late now. The kind of late where even the rats had quieted down, and the last candle burned low, throwing shadows against the warped walls like puppets in mourning. In the corner of his narrow room, Thomas lay on his straw-stuffed mattress, cocooned in scratchy blankets, the familiar weight of exhaustion pressing down on him like a second quilt. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was the silence, rare and reluctant, or maybe it was the simple, soft ache of being too tired to think. Either way, the usual litany of discomforts didn't bother him. The bed's uneven lump, a minor inconvenience. The cold air against his nose, almost refreshing. The neighbors wheezing, practically white noise now. Tonight, Thomas wasn't just lying in a boarding house bed, he was lying in a legacy, a place passed down, not by blood or deed, but by necessity, a shared space in a shared world, filled with strangers who snored and cooked and wept and whispered in the dark. And somehow, that truth brought comfort. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows. Not in anger, just passing through. The streets below were quiet, damp, and dimly lit by the fading glow of the tavern, 2 doors down. A dog barked once, as if reminding the universe that it still existed. Then silence again. Thomas shifted beneath the blanket and stared at the ceiling, that familiar, slanted plane of stained plaster and exposed beams, each crack a roadmap of someone else's worries. He traced them with his eyes, like stargazing in reverse. How many people had stared at this same spot, wondering if tomorrow would be kinder than today? Let that settle, because here's the thing. Sleeping in a 1700s boarding house wasn't just about rest. It was about survival, about carving out peace in a world that rarely offered any. It was about finding stillness while surrounded by noise, warmth in the middle of drafty indifference, human connection, accidental, fleeting, in a space not designed for comfort, but for function. And it was never just about the bed. It was about what sleep meant. A pause, a reprieve, a space between days where anything was possible, even if everything still smelled like damp wool and burnt porridge. Thomas exhaled slowly. He remembered the morning cries of children on the floor below, the sharp scold of Mrs. Greeley barking at a lodger for tracking mud through the hallway, William's laughter, unfiltered and always a little too loud, the soft tread of Annie's feet as she carried water in the early hours, the creak of the stair, always 2 steps from the bottom. That meant someone was home. All those pieces came together here, in this moment, in this bed. And so, he allowed himself to drift. The house breathed with him. Not in a supernatural way. No ghosts tonight. Not even the old hag. Just the natural respiration of wood and wind and people snoring in unison. And as Thomas's thoughts softened, slowing to the rhythm of near sleep, the boarding house itself seemed to settle, as if, just for tonight, it would let him rest without complaint. And maybe that's the real ending. Not a grand epiphany. Not a rousing speech. Just a man in a borrowed bed, in a borrowed century, finally closing his eyes. And for the first time in weeks, not thinking about rats, or rent, or the coughing from room 4. Just thinking, nothing, letting go, drifting. Because for all its flaws, the noise, the stench, the shared suffering, the boarding house gave him this: a bed, a roof, a pause in the storm, a place to rest before the world started again. And now, maybe, it gives that to you too. So close your eyes, breathe deep, let the sounds fade. Let the creaks become comfort. The 1700s may have been a nightmare, but now at least, you're in your own bed. Sleep tight, and pray the chamber pot doesn't tip. Still awake? Impressive. If this dusty descent into historical misery helped you drift off, go ahead, like, subscribe, or whisper your worst roommate story in the comments. I won't judge. And if you're already dreaming of straw mattresses and cold porridge, sleep well. You've officially survived your night in the 1700s. No lice required.